OWCS has nearly started, so we better get our power rankings done for our final region, EMEA. And what a stacked lineup we have in EMEA this year. 3 partner teams, as well as a lot of outside investment from Saudi organizations in particular, mean EMEA is about as stacked as it's ever been. So it's going to be super hard to filter out all these different teams, but I'm going to do my absolute best. Before we jump into that, though, I want to take a look at the format, just so we know what the stakes are for all the teams coming into this. So these are our 8 teams in the top 8 of OWCS. Gen.g, Twisted Minds, and Virtus Pro are our partner teams. The Ultimates and Al-Qadisiyah are 2 of the orgs also investing very heavily. Saudi organizations. Similarly, Vision qualified for the Open Qualifier, another Saudi organization. Team Peps are, of course, the French org that have been around for a long time, representing again. And Sakura, probably the newest team here, or the team with the most new faces on it. The way it's going to work is the regular season will be a big round robin. All the teams are going to play each other every weekend for the next 6 weeks. After they've done that, they will filter themselves out into 3 groups. These 3 groups are going to be the top 2. These top 2 teams go to playoffs, but they get to skip around and go to the semi-finals. Then the next 4 teams, they also go to playoffs, but they go into the upper bracket quarterfinals, meaning they have to play an extra round and fight it out amongst themselves for a chance to play against those top 2 teams. The bottom 2 teams, however, they are going to go into promotion and relegation. This means they will have to play the top 2 teams from Face It Masters League in a double elimination bracket where the top 2 teams return to OWCS for Stage 8. Now, that's not going to happen until after the regional playoffs, but before the LAN event. So a while to wait for that one, but that's when that will happen. For the rest of the teams who do make playoffs, they'll go into this double elimination bracket, and then it's pretty straightforward there, where it's a standard bracket. The top 2 teams, the 2 teams in this grand final, they get to go to the first international event of the year. They get to go to China and compete against the best teams from the other regions. So a lot of stakes on the line, a lot to play for, and a lot of quite evenly matched teams. So let's learn about these teams. Here are 8 teams. If you've not seen this spreadsheet before, pretty straightforward. We got the team names on the left, then we got our tank players in green, our DPS players in pink, and our support players in blue. Nice and easy. So, as always, we're going to start at the bottom of these power rankings, as it is more often than not a little bit simpler to start at the bottom. And I think actually, even though it's a very evenly matched region, I think the obvious bottom team is actually going to be Vision Esports. They were the last team to qualify for OWCS through the Open Qualifier. A lot of these players you might be less familiar with. Maybe you've seen a few of them in Saudi E-Leagues before. It is a majority Saudi roster, with 2 Korean players on the roster, Taejong and Simple. Of course, Simple, a lot of high success on Pokerface last year, very well known for his Zen, and he used this Zen to help them through the Open Qualifiers as well. And we'll see this more in hero bans, where if you have a niche or specific comp, and then you can empower it with hero bans to protect against some things that would normally counter the Zen out a little bit, you can find a lot of success. It's no surprise that Vision always won Blizzard World in those Open Qualifiers. And we might see some of the same here, where on certain maps, certain types where they have control of the bans, we'll see them be very strong, and I'm sure they'll pick up a Blizzard World or 2 along the way. The problem is, you can do that on 1 or 2 maps, but I think they run out of steam across an entire series. I think when you factor in similar things that we talked about, other teams that have specialist compositions or only really one composition they're at a really high level on, like Amplify in North America, this is quite good in a bracket format where you don't always know who you're going to play. Maybe you've not got a lot of preparation time. Now, in a regular season, everyone is going to know when they're playing Vision Esports. They're going to have plenty of time to prepare against it. They're going to have plenty of time to study what maps they pick, what heroes they play, what rotations they do. And also, they'll get to see what have other teams done to counter this out or to deal with this competition. Maybe we can copy some of that or steal some of their ideas. So I think for Vision, the success was making top 8. And I think they're going to really struggle against a pretty stacked field in EMEA this year. The next team I'm going to place is going to be Sakura. I think this was a relatively easy one to place as well. While I think Hitori is one of the players who's picked up Hazard the fastest, and I think she's really set the standard in terms of some of the tech and things she's using, I think she's a high point, and they'll do quite well, maybe even cause an upset or 2 on these hazards, on these hazard mirrors. That we're going to see a lot in the opening weeks. But I think the rest of the roster doesn't quite stack up, and it's not because I necessarily think these are bad players. I think China and Zoro especially a pretty talented DPS line, but EMEA is so stacked that being pretty good, having a couple of high points, it's not enough in EMEA. The standard is so high this year. Now, even though Hazard meta does suit them, Hitori can certainly carry her team to victory in some of these situations. I think when you factor in there's going to be a patch partway through the tournament as well. Now, presumably we'll touch Hazard in some way, nerf him a little bit, maybe even nerf him into the ground. I think while Hattori is competitive, the rest of her team doesn't stack up to the rest of the EMEA competition, so they are probably going to find themselves in a relegation scrap. For what it's worth, I'd probably give them a decent shot of bouncing right back out of that promotion relegation and staying in OWCS for stage 2. But I think this will be a tough stage 1. I mean, it'll be a tough stage 1 for every team, but I think particularly tough for Sakura as well. And then there's 6 teams left, but it gets really hard really quickly. I think when I originally pictured EMEA, I was really thinking top 5 teams and maybe Peps as the tier break. But word on the street of Peps are actually doing quite well. And I can see why. When I look at this Peps team, I think Ice, a very solid tank, decent flexibility. I think definitely a tank that trended up through last year and hopefully now on a top 8 team can continue that upward trajectory. Where it gets really exciting for Peps though is his DPS. Zodial, big breakout talent last year. Ken, a player we've really only seen have his biggest successes on these one-trick teams, but always was one of the most talented players there. Can play hit scan as well as Tracer, other flex DPS as well. Similarly, Zodial was a hit scan player who can also play flex DPS. They've even got Soon if they need him. While I was really excited for Soon coming back and the announcement was so bloody hype, I think Soon is going to be a bit part player for this roster, but I don't think that hurts Peps too much because Ken and Zodial, such great built-in flexibility between the two of them, I think they could cause some real problems for teams. Potential weak point for this Peps roster, I think, is the backline. Zerion and FD God will be picking up the mantle. I think FD God is certainly a player you can target. With hero bans, you get him off Lucio, and suddenly I think he looks a lot more vulnerable. Zerion is a player who has a super high mechanical ceiling. You will see him hit a lot of shots, especially on Kiriko. You will see him dink a load of people. But I think over the past year, I feel like Zerion has been lacking a little bit of the macro in terms of poor value out of support ults. This is certainly a problem that can be fixed, and maybe Peps have fixed this a little bit, but certainly more problems with the backline than anywhere else in the roster, and I think that ultimately, in such a competitive region, this is what is going to hold Peps back a little bit. So even though I think they will go toe-to-toe, I think they will take not just maps, but they will take series off a lot of these teams around them, I think they will run out of steam and won't be able to make it over the line or climb too far up. So I am going to put them in 6th place, even though I think this is a 6th place, but could quite easily move up a place or two. Now, this is where it gets really messy. In fact, it gets so messy right now that I'm going to skip a few tiers and go for what I think is the obvious next choice. That is actually the number 1 team in EMEA is going to be Twisted Minds. I think on paper, this roster looks the best. I think they've got a 7-person roster. They've got basically every role filled, right? I think Hadi, one of the most well-rounded tanks in EMEA, can play all of the heroes to a good level. Great understanding of the macro, great understanding of a push-pull, a great leader of the team, a great mind of the game as well. So a great start there. They've even got TV&T, who I think will be predominantly used for Saudi E-League, but also does have a good Diva, does have a particularly good Sigma, so in some of these more niche scenarios, maybe heroes that Hadi has particularly struggled on compared to a lot of the strong off-tank players in EMEA, like Diva and stuff. There is a place for TV&T in certain positions here, but expect Hadi to take most of the work, but I think Hadi will be good at it as well. Got to ask the question, of course, Hadi, TV&T, we've not really seen them play Hazard. What level will they reach on those heroes? But Hadi's normally pretty decent at all the tanks that come out, so I'm not too worried about that. Hadi is a player who often, the strongest part of his game is always his decision-making and the macro side of things, so even if he's a bit slower or a bit behind some other players in terms of raw mechanics, I think he will hold his own. And when we start to get onto the DPS lineup of this team, I think you can see why this team's going to be so good. Psycho, Quartz, Yubi, it's got everything covered, right? Quartz, probably the best player in EMEA right now. Unbelievable talent, unbelievable carry potential. Did so much of the work to give Twisted Minds that strong finish at Stockholm. You now pair him with Psycho, and I think Psycho was a super exciting player last season. I think really toe-to-toe with Kev in terms of individual performance. Now he's paired with Quartz. This is the best DPS duo in EMEA right now. And then you have Yubi, who even though Psycho can play Mei, can play Sim, in these more brawly comps, Yubi can come in and play that role. And we all know what Yubi does on those roles. He becomes the in-game leader, micro, macro, does everything for the team. A huge factor in any of that sort of success. Obviously, combine that with players like Hadi and Astro, who have had success with those type of comps in the past as well. This looks like an unbelievable brawl team if those matchups ever come into play during stage 1 or later in the year. And also even gives them a bit of double flex DPS. Obviously, you get Yubi on Tracer, maybe Psycho on Genji or Echo or something. Starts to look pretty good on a few of these maps as well. And I think Quartz shouldn't really be written out. I think even though we always think of Quartz as the hitscan player because he is so bloody good at that role, actually, Echo, flex DPS heroes, he can do okay. He can hold his own, and maybe he won't be as good as the true flex DPS players. But I think when you look at some of the other players like a Kai, a Shockwave, stuff like this, I think he's flex DPS is more than good enough to compete with Nose if he gets forced into it in some situations, if not better than a couple of Nose players. Of course, backline we have Funny Astro, and I think that sort of speaks for itself. I think Astro, playing a lot of Juno for SSG last season, was a huge turning point in terms of his viability in a hero ban world, because it now means he can just sort of bounce between those two heroes, use Brig when he has to. Makes him a little bit less vulnerable to some of these target bans. The only real big question mark on this Twisted Minds roster has to be Irony. I thought Irony's performances last season really hit and miss. At times looks even quite poor, a little bit vulnerable, always the one dying first. Big question mark. The only Korean on the team, no Korean coach on the team. How will he fit in? How will he blend in? How good will his English be? This is the biggest question mark for me in the team. But everything else is so overwhelmingly positive. That question mark, while it does need to be answered and Irony has something to prove, I think all of these rosters we're going to look at in EMEA have some kind of question mark or some kind of weakness that needs to be answered or need to be accounted for. And I think Twisted Minds have the least of those. So I think while Irony is the biggest question mark, it's a smaller question now we're going to see across some of these other teams. So I think Twisted Minds, they have to be favourites for Stage 1, have to be favourites to qualify for China in some form, and really excited to see how this team does. I think Psycho and Quartz, an unbelievable DPS line, going to be so much fun to watch them play. You combine that with a lot of great minds in terms of like Hadi, Yubi, and Astro as well in all of this. It looks a really complete team. Ben Best at the helm, everyone has said, everyone I've talked to, says he's a really good coach. He's obviously up against a stacked coaching roster as well in terms of Krusty, Junkbuck, and Chris all working in the region as well. But I think everything I've heard about Ben has been positive, so lots of things looking good for Twisted Minds right now, and it might be them on top. Then this next bit gets really messy, not just because I think the teams are pretty evenly matched. Also, you got to bear in mind, out of these next 4 teams we're going to talk about, only one of them can go to China, presuming Twisted Minds take one of those spots. So it's going to be ultra competitive. Every result is going to matter. That regional playoff at the end of a regular season is going to be an absolute bloodbath. It's going to be so competitive. The stakes really couldn't be higher. So what I'm going to do, because I think it's so evenly matched, I'm going to talk about all of the teams, and then we'll try and sort of separate them out into a second, third, fourth, and fifth. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just sort of start top to bottom here, really. In terms of top to bottom as they're listed. Not a spoiler for the rankings. I've got to figure that one out. Easier said than done. So we'll start with gen.g. gen.g is a super interesting team. That maybe sounds like a backhanded compliment, but I think interesting in a good way as well. I think Mag, the asset, he can play most of the heroes. He's had lots of chances before, of course, and he probably is actually the experience on this team. I think he's a pretty solid tank player, though. Obviously, has a really high level on Winston, probably quite clearly the best Winston in the region as well, and decent flexibility across other heroes. So as far as a solo tank goes, probably alongside Hadi, this was about as good a signing as you could make in EMEA. So I think Mag will be really fine. I don't think he'll be the problem. I think there will be certain heroes where he is just gapped by some of the players on these other teams, but I think fairly competitive. Over onto the DPS, where gen.g have made a really interesting decision here, where they're the only team not to sign a traditional hitscan player. They've gone for 2 flex DPS, Top Dragon and Sauna. Sauna has played some hitscan before, previously in Contenders, and maybe most notably at the World Cup for Team Finland, where he actually did very well. The problem for Sauna is, though, that hitscan and EMEA, it's stacked. It's stacked. Quartz, Kai, Shockwave, even Lubda looking really good, Zodial. So I think Sauna maybe has his work cut out. Maybe on Sojourn, it's less of a problem, but once we get over to an Ashe or a Widow, that's where Sauna maybe really struggles. The thing is, though, a lot of the time, if they're running a hit scan, one of the solutions can be double flex DPS. So if you find situations where you've got Sauna on Tracer and Top Dragon on Genji, maybe both players on their best heroes, maybe that's a good counter. Mag on the dive heroes, on the Winston. Maybe that is a really good counter to a lot of these harder hit scan competitions, and they can work around that. And I think gen.g will have to be smart to work around it. They have to play to their strengths. I don't know if they're just going to be taking these hit scan matchups. I think Sauna will get gapped by a lot of his counterparts, but I think there's lots of counterplay options for gen.g in terms of bans and comps they select for themselves. And you have to remember as well, all of last year, it felt like double flex DPS was increasingly popular, increasingly valuable. So it's a gamble for sure with this gen.g roster, especially with only a 5-person roster. But I think it's a pretty reasonable gamble, actually, based on how Overwatch has been lately. So that actually I think looks quite reasonable, and I think quite exciting to watch. Kaneo and Crispy are maybe a bit of a question mark on the backline here. I think in general, the support role in EMEA is the weakest. So the idea to gamble on two players who have played a bit together before, maybe less experience. I think for Kaneo and Crispy, and probably even Sauna as well, honestly, maybe even Top Dragon, this is actually the best team they've been on. We often think of like players like Top Dragon being the carry on a weaker team and stuff like this. So I think this team is probably exactly what Krusty wanted, right? He wanted a young team, eager to prove themselves, ready to work hard, a lot of untapped potential. I think they've got that, but Sauna and Top Dragon, I think they'll deliver. But Kaneo and Crispy, there's bigger question marks there, and I think they've got more to prove. And if there is going to be a potential weakness, I think it will come in the support line right now. The saving grace is, I think as we go through these teams, we're going to talk about the support line and the back line, maybe being potential weaknesses for a lot of these teams. We were even with Twisted Minds, we were raising question marks about Irony, right? So I think all the EMEA teams are in a pretty similar situation here, where the supports have the most to prove, and if any of these backlines can really establish themselves as a top duo, it'll be a huge advantage for their team going through the season. Top Dragon, though, the player I'm most excited to see. We've seen Top Dragon on Aoma. He was the one-man army carrying his team to success. I think this is the team, this is the year. Top Dragon, can he finally deliver on all that potential, all these carry performances? Can he blend with a team that's maybe a bit more on his skill level, and how far can he go? Because Flex DPS, it's stacked in EMEA. Psycho, Kevster, Checkmate, Jwoo. These are good, these are really good players. The standard is so high. Top Dragon now gets a chance to prove himself against these players, and I think he's got a pretty good chance. Then tie that in with a lot of strengths for this roster. They do complement each other. You know, we talk about Top Dragon, Sauna both playing double Flex DPS, and then Mag playing some kind of dive hero. It all seems to blend itself together. So the roster does seem to make sense, even though there are some weaknesses. Then we'll talk about Virtus Pro. Now, Virtus Pro is a bit of a weird team in the sense that there are some clearly good pieces from established talent last year, from both ENCE and Virtus Pro. Gala, Vessler, Shockwave, these are all pretty locked-in top OWCS players. Vessler especially, super high hero on his good heroes, D.Va, Sigma. And then we have to talk about Vessler as a solo tank maybe feels a little bit risky. I know he's shown us some Ramattra in the past, some Mauga in the past, but I feel like on Ramattra and Mauga and these type of heroes, Vessler is good, but he's not as good as KSA, he's not as good as Hadi, and this could be a real problem for them that, in reality, outside D.Va and Sigma, I don't know how competitive Vessler is on some of these other heroes. Obviously, there's the question mark of Hazard as well. This is true of Hadi, this is true of Mag. We've not seen these players play Hazard yet, so we don't know exactly what to expect or how that Hazard power ranking is between all the teams. We have seen D.Va get played a decent amount in Korea, so maybe there's a way for Virtus Pro to enable Vessler. I think, much as we talked about gen.g having to be quite smart with their bans, Virtus Pro's roster has a lot of limitations as well, so they have to be quite smart in their bans. And generally what you see is the more limited your roster is in terms of flexibility, you can have a couple of maps where you can really play to your strengths, enable your good players to play their good heroes. But across the series, you run out of ban options or map options that can enable that. So that will be the biggest problem for teams like Virtus Pro. But I think Vessler on the right heroes, as good as any, if not the best in the region at a couple of those heroes as well. Then we get on to the DPS. I think Shockwave a player with decent flexibility, obviously a 5-person roster, so we have to make the double flex DPS consideration that we do with all these teams. I think Shockwave is okay, like for Tracer and Echo. Again, won't compete, say if it's versus a Top Dragon Sauna or a Psycho Yubi, but can do it, but I don't think it's really their strength. I think for Shockwave, we saw glimpses last year of him taking over on Hitscan, particularly on Widow, even on a couple of maps. I remember at Junkertown very clearly where he took over, but still a player I think with a lot to prove. Again, we talk about Flex DPS being stacked in EMEA, but actually so is Hitscan as well. So Shockwave, right now, I'd probably put him about in the middle of that Hitscan power ranking. So I think has to do more. I think Shockwave is going to be a crucial part of this team because he's also going to be one of the most vocal players, both in-game and out of game. So I think Shockwave has a lot of weight on his shoulders here to step up both himself and also sort of bring his team along with him as well. Over on the other side, it's Jwoo playing the Flex DPS. And again, stacked DPS roster, lots of questions for Jwoo. Had some success last season with Pokerface as well, in a similarly stacked region. So Jwoo, I think, can be a very impactful player here. I still need to see more to be convinced, right? Would I put him above Psycho and Kevster right now? Probably not, actually, but he can compete. So Jwoo, another player with a lot to prove, and it's kind of going to be the theme, I think, of a lot of this Virtus Pro roster. Gala is a player as well, as we move on to supports with a lot of potential. I think he's got incredible flexibility. We saw him carry on Alari last year. The biggest problem for Virtus Pro, though, is because Gala is now partnered with Fixer, as opposed to being partnered with someone like Kanail, how do you get Gala onto these Alaris? Does Fixer feel? We've seen it play bits of Ana in the past, but is that really where you want Fixer to be? Is that really what position you want to put Fixer in? So I feel like, even though Gala is going to be probably one of the better flex supports in the region, I think you lose a lot of the advantage of the fact that he can play Lucio and play these other flex support heroes. I think I would have much preferred to see him paired with Kanail, or paired with Sky or something, or even paired with Landon or something, you know? What another flex support that really allows you to get the most out of Gala in a hero ban meta, like we saw so much at the Esports World Cup. Again, teams like Zeta Division, Toronto, and of course Virtus Pro themselves doing it as well. Fixer he's okay. I think support is a problem area in EMEA for all of these teams. I think Fixer is just mid, if I'm being honest. He's okay at support. I think he can get targeted in terms of bans a little bit as well, you know, in terms of like force him off Lucio, similar to a few of these others. So I think there's problems with the backline there, and there's maybe limitation in terms of how well they can get their flexibility out. The thing I can say for Virtus Pro is at least between, like, there's maybe a few compositions where actually if you can get Vestler on the right hero and you can play Hitscan and Jaywood can be on a good hero, and then Gala could be even on like an Ana or even a Kiri or something. There are compositions where actually this Virtus Pro team can look like one of the stronger teams. But I think the hero bans is actually going to work against them quite hard with these limitations. And while they'll have some strong maps, they'll struggle to close out series as we get to map 4 and map 5. And maybe a lot of the weight here does fall onto Vestler's shoulders in terms of if Vestler actually just has one of the better hazards in the region, this might actually just solve some of these hero pool issues or some of these limitations we talk about for the roster. But not seen it so far from Vestler, so yeah. Loads of question marks and possible problems for Virtus Pro that I think they're into. So I'm not going to do the rankings yet, but maybe from what I've said, you can kind of... My feeling right now is to put them towards the bottom of this sort of pool of 4 teams. Then we get to the Ultimates, which, while not being a partner team, has one of the most stacked rosters on paper. The Ultimates have this classic tank lineup of a guy who mainly plays the off-tanks and a guy who mainly plays the main tanks. KSA will be carrying a lot of that off-tank weight. And he's shown a really high level on all of these heroes. Diva, Sigma, of course, but actually he's Rematri's Mauga is really good as well. So I think KSA is a great signing, very strong tank player. And then you have Chase to fill in on stuff like the Winston and stuff like the Ball. Now, Chase, finally, able to play, able to compete at lands, which is great for him, and a chance for him to maybe deliver on a lot of his potential. I think it is a big question mark. I think last year we saw him do a really high level on Orisa for Ex-Oblivion. And then when he moved to Ents, he sort of found himself stuck on the bench because he couldn't attend the LAN, so we didn't really get to see him really used to his full potential. We saw him playing some Winston. He had some success. He had some bad performances as well. So I think Chase still has a lot to prove as the dive tank here. It's a big question mark for the Ultimates. But the saving grace is if it doesn't work out, KSA can still play Diva or even play a lot of the Hazard as we saw him do in the Open Qualifier as well. So I think there are backup options for Ultimates to give them some insurance policy in that. So not too worried about the tanks from the Ultimates. And I like Chase. I think he's a good player. I think he's really keen to improve and prove himself. So I hope it goes well for him. But that has to be said, it's one of the things that the Ultimates will need to solve. And if they're going to have big success this season in such a competitive region, having Chase step up will be a massive help. One area they don't have an insurance policy is DPS. It's Kevster and Kai. It's the Ents duo. And we kind of know what we're getting with this, right? We know what they're good at. We know what they're maybe not so good at. Again, double flex DPS doesn't seem so possible within this lineup. Kai has a bit of Tracer, but not really competitive with any real Tracer players. So they're going to have to lean on the hit scan a lot. And right now, and that's maybe a problem, because normally the original theory behind this, I think, was that hit scan's not really bannable in a hero ban meta, because, oh, you're going to ban Sojourn, I'll just go Cass. Oh, you're going to ban Cass, I'll just go Sojourn, or I'll go Ashe, or whatever it might be. There's always a side grade. Maybe in this current Hazard meta, that's less true than it maybe ever has been historically. But I think when we get a patch, and maybe when Hazard gets toned down a little bit, maybe that does become true again, and they get away with it a lot more. There will be some maps where they really struggle, and maybe where Kai gets targeted a lot. But I think we know what we get with this DPS duo. I do think there is an element of proving themselves again. I think Kevster, all of a sudden, he's not the standout best in the region by a country mile. I think Psycho is right now with him. I think Checkmate is right now with him. I think Top Dragon and Jaywu both have the ability to be competitive with him as well. So I think really we need the return of Kevster at his best here, because it's going to be super competitive, and the Ultimates are going to need their star man to be their star man. Similarly, I think we've talked about it many times already. Stack DPS lineups, both in Flex DPS and Hitscan. So Kai is going to have to try and find top form to stay ahead in Vs, especially when you look at players like Quartz on Twisted Minds, a tough player to go toe-to-toe with. Once we get to the backline, interesting decisions here, right? We talked about how support is a bit of a weak role in EMEA. So what's one way to solve that problem? Get an entire Korean backline. Get Twilight, get Faith. I think Faith is a player I really like. I think he's kind of a little bit slept on. I think his Brig is super good. I think his Lucio's really fine. Again, a little bit problems. Maybe you can get targeted here, right? He has to go between Lucio and Brig, but with the introduction of Juno, there seem to be more side grades to get around Lucio bans and stuff like this. So I think he'll be all right. Twilight, we all know how good he is at Ana. What we don't know, what nobody knows, is how good is he at Ana today? Because we know he was great at Ana, but how close to that old level can he get at? Super high talent flex support when he was in Overwatch League, but how good is he now? He's not with the team currently yet. He's not in EMEA, so he's also going to have a bit of a slower start than the rest of them. So how much impact can he have? It's certainly a gamble. If that gamble pays off, I think it plays into the hands where actually with Chase, with an all-Korean backline and like a really top Ana Brig, if it pays off, well, actually, maybe they can really be the sort of dive champions of EMEA. Sky comes into this as well. I think Sky might actually end up playing more, maybe outside some of his Ana maps, or as good as Twilight is. And maybe the nice thing about Sky is similarly to how we talked about the tanks here, is if Chase can't find the right form or it doesn't work out, KSA is a great option. Sky is probably one of the better Anas in the region, so if Twilight doesn't work out, maybe there is a bit of an insurance policy there. And like we said, EMEA, not the most stacked region for support, so I think makes sense to import from this spot. A couple of quite a big gamble there in terms of Twilight, but I think reasonable roundouts of a roster. I think it should, in theory, give them a strong advantage in dive maps and in hero bans and losers pick. There's lots of opportunities to go to dive maps, especially the way they've changed the format now. So in map 5, you can pick from all the modes and basically any map that hasn't already been played, which means map 5, if they get that pick, there's loads of dive options for them. So I think it's probably a good comp to be good at in terms of how the order of maps and the structure of series will go. So I think even though the ultimate word on the street, I think Quartz did a thing that was translated onto Reddit where he said maybe the ultimates don't look that good in scrims right now. I think this is a team, Chris at the helm, will get better over time. Will probably get better when Twilight comes back as well. So I think there's reasons to be positive about this team, even though there's plenty of question marks in terms of flexibility. How good will Twilight be? How good will Chase be? All of this. Then we get to OWCS. Now, this is a team that's really interesting. Coached by Junkbuck, Checkmate, Landon, Lubda, Haku, Tread, and then Ziad and QLM as well. I think I very much expect Ziad to be mostly just used for Saudi E-League. QLM as well, maybe just more for some specialist roles, maybe some Widow maps or something. He's certainly a player that people really rate his aim quite highly, so might become available at times. But for the most part, Lubda will actually be doing the hit scan responsibilities. A player who's played this loads in ranked, and I think people saw in the open qualifiers, he's the real deal on it. Went toe-to-toe with Kai, got the better of Kai in that series, so I think Lubda on hit scan, with the ability to swap over to these double flex DPS heroes as well, combined with Checkmate, who has a fantastic hero pool, and a super high-level player as well. I think lots of reasons to be really high on this team. I think Checkmate as well, not just a super talented player, Overwatch League champion. I think he's super important in terms of in-game leadership, how intelligent he is about the game, and I think you look at maybe some of the less experienced people on this roster, people like Lubda, people like Haku, people like Tread. I think Junkbuck, Checkmate, and Landon as well. You surround him with players who can do a lot of the calling, can direct him, can help teach him. There's a chance here that some of these players, all of Lubda's raw talent is converted into big success. All of Tread's potential converted as well. I think we'll see Tread especially go on a pretty big improvement arc on this team. And lots of reasons to be positive about that. The biggest weak link is it's an EMEA Classic. Maybe it's for supports. Landon, not as worried about. A bit targetable with hero bans. I think obviously Baptiste is really good for him, but Baptiste doesn't really exist as a viable hero all that much right now. So having to be leaning on others. And there are definitely holes in Landon's hero pool roster as well. You talk about Ana, Zen, these heroes aren't really online in the same way. But I think Kiri, Baptiste, Juno maybe to be decided as well, right? Because obviously Astro played that a lot on SSG. So some question marks for Landon, but I think I'm less worried about Landon than I am about Haku. Haku, while he did win the Overwatch World Cup, did it mostly playing Lucio, and I worry again, is he the potential weak link? Is he the person who's going to get targeted the most in terms of hero bans here? Because rest of the roster, Lupta, Checkmate, Tread, great flexibility, hard to target ban these players. But Haku, I think can be targeted right now. The saving grace is, most people have question marks about their main support in EMEA. Maybe, unless your Twitter's minds, funny Astro. I think everyone else has an element of a question mark about them. Not Astro, probably least so Faith. So I think if you're going to have a weakness somewhere, it probably is going to be in that position here. It's a little bit slim pickings. I mean, not just in EMEA, but in North America as well. So there are problems for this roster, but actually with Junkbuck at the helm, I'm super, super high on this roster, actually. I think a lot of people are underrating them. I think people are underrating Checkmate because he had some bad performances on Rock last year. And, I understand there's a bit of deja vu here. He went over to a Saudi organization. He had some really terrible performances for Rock Esports last year. But when he went back to Fnatic, he was actually really back to his best. He was probably the best player on that Fnatic team at the Esports World Cup, maybe alongside Donghack to a degree, but I thought he was super good and a player that people should really fear, right? I think all of a sudden, again, we talk about Kev, so cycle all of this, Checkmate is right up there with them. On some heroes, probably even above them as well. So I think this is a team to be really excited about, AWCS, if they can translate that into reality. Also, I think they've got a bit of a bit to prove as well, right? Because people aren't rating them as highly, so they want to prove they can contest with Twisted Minds and the Ultimates and these other big organizations. But okay, I feel like I've sort of set the scene. We've talked about all the teams, advantages, disadvantages, which now the tricky part. How do I separate all of these teams? So I think I'm going to put Virtus.pro at the bottom. I think they're the team with, I say bottom, but fifth. I think they're the team with the most weaknesses, the most question marks, the stuff that's easiest to exploit. I think they'll still take maps, they'll still be competitive, but again, I think the format is going to work against them here, and eventually they'll run out of bans and run out of map picks that can enable them to play viable compositions. Really, if the saving grace will be if Vessler can have like a really top hazard on him or something that can maybe solve some of these problems. But I feel, quite limited in that sense. Then it gets really tight because I really like AWCS. I think the Ultimates roster has a lot of high potential, but it's yet to be proven. I think it's worth considering these power rankings. I'm not just talking about who's going to win this weekend. I'm talking about who's going to win stage 1, right? These are the rankings for the end of playoffs, essentially, right? So I think, hazard is super important right now, and that maybe hurts some teams more than others. I think the longer we go through, there'll be another patch mid-tournament. This will change some of the heroes, presumably Hazard. So I'm working on that assumption that Hazard isn't going to be meta for all of Stage 1. And I think that will certainly buff teams, especially teams like the Ultimates. Like, I think if anything right now, this meta probably suits gen.g a bit more than it does the Ultimates. But I think once Hazard maybe gets toned down and just becomes a viable pick, but not a must pick in a lot of situations, I think all of a sudden, the Ultimates' bigger roster might start to overtake gen.g in some of those. So I think gen.g, while they have some really high highs, I think, on some, and I think they might start very strong. They've had a boot camp in Korea and everything like this as well, so they've really started on a good foot. I think eventually they're going to run out of steam a little bit here, and I'll probably put them 4th. Yeah, I'm going to question myself here, but I think, 4th. I think they're the team that are most likely to maybe go up in these rankings. And then it becomes a TU AWCS situation. And I think the question has to be, again, if you ask me who's better right now, or who's better in this meta, probably AWCS. But I think across a patch, across more games, across the hero bans, TU I think overtake, even if it might be a slow start. So I think by the time we get to the end, maybe it is TU in this 2nd spot, and AWCS in this 3rd spot. Which, I mean, ultimately puts us on a Saudi on top situation where I'm saying the top 3 teams are going to be the Saudi organizations. I think in terms of like where I think there will be movement, I think Peps could quite easily bump up a place or 2. Virtus.pro maybe could go up a place, but I'm less likely. I think gen.g could be the big sort of dark horse here in terms of the upsets they can cause. And then really, to be fair, I put all 4 of these kind of in the top 4 with Virtus.pro just outside. So I think the Ultimates AWCS could really go either way. But I think, again, big picture, TU and Twisted Minds will just end up on top. AWCS will be really good at their closest challenges. gen.g will be really on top in certain maps, certain situations. But in terms of longevity is the wrong word, but in terms of, I guess, like ability to win on multiple comps across the series, I think Twisted Minds and the Ultimates rosters just look a bit better for that, you know? They can compete in the Hazard Mirrors, but they also have some really niche picks that are only really good for them, you know? So yeah, I think I'm okay with that. I think I'm okay. I think gen.g might start strong, then fall off a little bit. OWCS, I think. Third is probably higher than most people would put him right now, but I'm actually really confident in that team. And I think, if anything, OWCS will be closer to punching up than they will to be falling down, if that makes sense. So, am I happy with it? Yeah, I'm doing it. I'm locking in. Those are the rankings. Let me know in the comments below if you agree, disagree. This is a really competitive region, so I think there's lots of viable and reasonable alternatives to this, but that's what I'm locking in for now. If you have your own thoughts and opinions, let me know in the comments. Obviously, if you haven't already, like, subscribe to the channel, stay tuned for more action. I'll be covering all of this live on my Twitch as well, which will be in one of the corners right now. So go watch along on all the co-streams. We'll have OWCS drops all year on my channel. So come watch along and we can see if I turn out to be right or if I turn out to be wrong. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you in the next one.